Welcome to Monologues by Hasi, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. Last week was a milestone for Monologues by Hasi. I hit my first 100 episodes, so it is rather arbitrary, but nevertheless, it's a sign to myself that I was able to stick with something that I said I was going to stick with and go through it. So the topic of this week's episode is decoupling effort from outcomes. And I think this podcast is a great example of that because the outcome is nothing really substantial. But what I've done over the last 2 years since running this podcast is fall in love with the process of actually going ahead and creating things. And I think this is the big reason why a lot of people don't actually start things and don't finish them. If they do decide to start them, it is because they expect there to be a particular outcome from the effort that they put in. And unfortunately, once you leave the school system, once you leave the university system, the world no longer works like this. When you're in school, you can basically study a particular rubric that they give you, a syllabus, and it's very well defined. And if you do the particular steps and you're diligent enough, you can go and earn a particular mark. But the real world doesn't work like this because a lot of the things we do, we will put effort in, but the outcome is not promised to us. And this podcast is one of the many things that I've done where the outcome is definitely not well coupled with the effort, because a lot of people who look at the number of listeners I have for this will simply tell me, why on earth are you wasting time? Well, it is something I enjoy, and there's a couple of things that I've learned throughout this process which only make me more powerful. So it was a few years ago, I actually wanted to do a podcast with a friend of mine. And at that time, we were very much into Stoicism. We were discovering Stoic books. We were trying to read Marcus Aurelius, which again took a very long time for me to actually read. Meditations, despite being a short book, is a very difficult one to read, but I definitely recommend people get out there and read it. Nonetheless, we wanted to do a podcast on Stoicism, and we had so many meetings. We used to meet up, we used to write ideas, discuss the topics. We even had a Google Drive with podcast ideas and what we were going to do. And despite all of this planning, we never actually got started. We could never get our schedules on track, and it was one of these things where I think after a certain amount of time, both of us must have intrinsically realized that we weren't getting the particular outcome that we wanted. We must have both been at that time very outcome oriented, so the effort simply wasn't worth it. That podcast never went anywhere. And then I finally decided a few years later in 2022 to go about and actually start the podcast, but I decided to do it solo. And the reason I decided to do this solo was I realized that if I was the only person who has to be responsible for delivering the content of this podcast and actually going and editing it and posting it, then there is nobody else I can blame for the outcomes other than myself. Now, that's not to say it's not valuable to work with other people and to do things with other people, but I think a lot of people want to do great things immediately, and they don't understand that it is a matter of simply getting started. So down the track, I may have a podcast or do something maybe not media related that involves other people. And I definitely have this happening in my life now. I have a particular project where I'm partnering up with people and no longer working completely independently. But often, you will need to start doing something yourself rather than waiting for the world to come to you. So I decided to start this podcast myself. But even then, there was an immense period of procrastination. To create a podcast, you have intro and outro, which you hear every time you listen to this podcast. And it took me about 3 to 4 months simply to decide that, hey, I want an intro and outro that's somewhat professional, to actually going about and creating that intro and outro. So there was a huge delay from when I decided, hey, you're going to do this solo podcast about the things you're experiencing and how you're navigating the world and what lessons you're pulling out, to actually going ahead and making this happen. And there were so many things that I look back on that I had to create to start the podcast, namely the intro outro music, the graphic that you see when you look at the thumbnail on your podcast app, or if you're watching this on YouTube Music or YouTube. And those things, those assets that I needed to kind of get started, despite how simple they were, there was a lot of inertia that I had to overcome. And why? Because I was no longer operating in the paradigm of there is a direct correlation between effort and outcome. And when you forget that, you don't do things because you're always expecting an immediate return, and the world no longer works that way. We live in a very complex world, so it was just one of these things that I had to work myself out of. Nonetheless, after 3 to 4 months, I finally got around to getting this podcast out. And it was great. And I think it was really exciting. I launched it, people listened, but there came a time where I fell into a personal rut and I didn't post any episodes for about 4 to 5 months. I always have a general guideline that this podcast is a weekly thing. I never make it so intense that I don't enjoy the process, but it is my general goal that I like to create 1 episode per week on average. But there was a point where I definitely got into a rut and I kept delaying the episode that I had to create. It was like a procrastination cycle that didn't end for almost half a year. And I remember I had a friend who was really into my podcast initially, because very early listeners to my podcast were people in my immediate circle. That's no longer the case anymore. I had somebody download 100 episodes from the Netherlands this week. And it's one of these things where now there are people who listen to me who I wish I could know and get to meet, but I simply don't, because that's how the internet is working. And I only get statistics from where they're looking from, where they're listening from. And I remember this friend told me that because you stopped posting, I stopped listening, even though you've restarted. So even after I restarted, I lost that early inertia. And I think that's a very important lesson, because when you get something started, there is inertia. And it's not something that you will notice immediately. And it is not something that's going to be a major effect, but there is a compounding effect. It's like a snowball that you're rolling down a snowy mountain. And it's going to keep accumulating mass and getting bigger. But initially, you're not going to see this. So I definitely lost a lot of inertia and goodwill by falling into a 4 to 5 month rut where I did not post any podcasts, which is why even though this podcast has been out for, I guess, more than 2.5 years or 2 years at this point, I still am not quite at the 1 week per episode mark, because there was a definite period where I was not putting out any episodes. So that's something I learned from, which kind of brings me to my next lesson. After I came out of that rut, I have had a very good run in terms of posting episodes and creating content. But that has also caused other problems. And that being, there are times in my life, like when I was doing a lot of work and learning mobile development for the first time, I was investing so much time at work that I didn't leave a lot of time for the podcast. But I still felt that I had to deliver an episode every week. So there was one episode that I delivered. I can't remember the specific episode number, but I released an episode that was absolutely awful. And I knew it was awful because I was exhausted. I'd probably done a 70 to 80 hour week that week. I was challenging my brain, not with stuff I knew, but with stuff I didn't know. So it was a very difficult thing to deal with. And I released absolute garbage. I had somebody message me and say that episode you released was absolute trash. And it is something that definitely made me reflect. So first of all, it's important to take criticism from other people. And I'm grateful that people actually let me know when I produce a bad episode, because it's far more detrimental to my long-term success in anything I do if people hold back their feedback. But the lesson I learned was that I compromised quality to meet some idealistic time frame that I need to release an episode every week. And this is like a service level agreement that you'd have in a business. But I realize for those of you who decide to listen to this, I need to try and provide you with as much insight as I can from what I'm learning. And if I'm out there delivering garbage, then that's not necessarily a good thing. But there's a secondary lesson. So from that, I realized that if I need to be a day or two late because I need to recover from something I had to deal with in a particular week, then that is okay. Because I would much rather deliver better content to those of you who are listening to this podcast than do something that is too half-assed. But more importantly, it's despite having bad episodes, I have gone through the process of creating it. So there's both positives and negatives to what I've done and what I do and how I do it. Is that I realize the best process is iteration. It is not to try and achieve perfection through premature optimization. So the fact that I've been able to start this podcast and talk about the things that I'm dealing with, from changing my careers to things that's happening in my personal life, to deciding to quit my job, to sometimes the politics of the world, by going through this process of creating this podcast, you will notice that every episode is not necessarily better than the previous episode. But I would like to think that the long run trend of me creating this podcast is that I actually get better speaking to you. I get better at creating this podcast. And whilst it's not going to be perfectly consistent, there are going to be weeks where I am having a bad week. The general trend is that if you look at the first episode and you look at the 100th episode, I would like to think that my ability to speak and present my opinions and ideas has significantly improved. But that is not to say that every episode will be amazing. And I think that's something, if you are doing anything that's creative or you're trying to push your creativity, it is something that you need to become very accustomed with, is that not everything is going to become your best piece of work. And you shouldn't attach yourself to the outcome. And it's precisely that, because if your goal is to always beat what you previously did, which is a good goal, but if you're so strict about it that it stops you from creating something and stops you from releasing something, that is actually detrimental to what you want. If you do want to achieve perfection, you will achieve that through iteration, and that involves making lots of mistakes and getting out there and actually doing it. And so these are the many lessons that I've learned through my podcast. And then there's something that I've been asked about, which is, why did you introduce a blessing at the end of your podcast? As you know, when I end most of my podcasts, and I started this very early on, but if you listen to the very first few episodes, this blessing won't exist, but I wish everyone great success on all their endeavors. Now, the reason I do this is because it is a form of gratitude to everyone who decides to listen to this podcast and even entertain my opinions, whether you agree with them or not. It is a blessing for those of you who are doing things, because I know that people who generally listen to this podcast are people who are dealing with similar things that I am, in that they're trying to better their lives. And maybe the things that they're trying to achieve are different to what I am trying to achieve. But because I know that my listeners are from a particular demographic, and that is a demographic of people trying to improve themselves, I like to give the blessing that I wish you great success on all your endeavors. The only caveat there is, I wish you great success on all your endeavors should they be noble endeavors, right? So that's kind of the hidden caveat in that blessing. But having now done 100 podcasts, and this being the 101st episode, I'm grateful to the fact that I actually stuck with it. When I decided to start this podcast, I said, make a commitment, do this podcast for 3 years. It doesn't have to go forever, but at least do 3 years. And now that I'm kind of over the 2-year mark and I'm over 100 episodes, there is a feeling of pride. And I realized that even if nobody listened to this podcast, even if I got 0 listens for every episode after this, and for everything I put out there, I would still create this episode, because for me, there is a secondary utility. And that is everything I'm documenting now, every struggle that I've spoken about, is something that in the future, should I have children, I will be able to give them this volume of works and say, this is what your father was going through in his 20s, and soon it'll be what I'm going through in my 30s. And that is something incredibly valuable that I don't think a lot of parents necessarily pass down well to their children. So the fact that not only will my kids be able to get this from me, they will actually be able to hear the 29-year-old version of me speaking about my experiences when I was 29, not the 50-year-old version, not the 60-year-old version. They will be able to listen to a past version of me. And for me, that is incredible utility. The fact that I'm creating a living artifact that I can pass down, even if it's taken off the internet, I still hold all the local copies. So this is something where I really enjoy the process. The effort has now, I can say, for this podcast, it has well and truly been decoupled from the outcome that I'm going to have, some sort of crazy influence. Now, I think there's many benefits to independent media. It's probably a topic for another day, but I do think that mainstream media is, to say the least, it is probably the worst thing you can listen to. There are a lot of globalists. There is a lot of globalist agenda that's pushed down, and it's not necessarily good for individuals. It's not good for families. It's not good for society. So there is tremendous utility in independent content creators taking control of the mechanism of communication, and that is something that we need to do. And I think it's something that's great. Podcasts are one of those things where, with the exception, now I have recently pushed to YouTube, but with the podcast as it traditionally stands, it is something that is an algorithm-free form of media. People actually need to go out and find my podcasts. There is very limited metadata. There's not an algorithm that actually recommends my episodes to people. So it is a form of media that is not tied to what does well on the algorithm, and it is not tied to mainstream media. And there's many other podcasts like this. And that's not to say that I agree with every other independent media creator out there, but I think it's a really important thing that we need to protect. So with this podcast, to summarize, what I've really learned is that there is a lot of personal responsibility that you can take for your own actions. And when you become more accountable, then you're going to go get things done. You're going to make mistakes, and you need to balance making mistakes, iterating to perfection, with who you're creating for. And that there needs to be a baseline of quality. So it's always a fine balance. You don't want to go too far to either extreme. And that's something that I learned even 70 episodes in, when I did launch a very bad episode. Why? Because I was so focused on work that I did not care at that time about the quality of this podcast and the value I was providing to those of you who listen to this. And so that was a really good lesson for me. Learning to take criticism and feedback is very important on your journey. And fundamentally, just remember to decouple your effort from the outcome. If you would like to get somewhere, it is very easy to say that if I do steps X, Y, and Z, this should get me to where I want to be. But what happens is the world, as I said at the start of this podcast, doesn't work that way. So when people take action and they don't see the outcome that they want to get, this is where most people quit. This is why majority of the people who start New Year's resolutions and they want to do things like walk more or eat better, and they don't see results fast enough, this is when they quit, because the effort that they were taking is coupled in their minds to a particular outcome they want to get. They have not fallen in love with the process. And I think through a lot of trial and error, I have finally come with this podcast to love the process of actually getting here, speaking to you, and creating every episode and launching it out there. And I realized that for many of the things I do in my life that I'm trying to get better at, I also need to decouple that effort from the outcome. And that's still an uphill battle for me in many other domains of my life. So to those of you who are listening to this podcast today, I'm going to give you my blessing, as I always do. I wish you great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hasi. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhasi.com. Thanks for swinging by.